Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure.
So you're Australian born. You grew up in a city on the East Coast called Queanbeyan,
Yeah, that's right.
a kind of multicultural suburb.
Yeah, it's a small town. It was traditionally known as a working class area just outside of the capital of Australia, Canberra. It was a multicultural place. I grew up around people who are from all around the world trying to forge a life for themselves in Australia. It was known as Struggletown, a place where there was a lot of alcohol and kind of domestic violence and things like that. But now it's changing a lot. It's kind of gentrifying, and that seems to be the word on everyone's lips wherever I go in the world.
Is gentrification.
Oh, yeah. I was just in Brooklyn. I was just in Oakland. Definitely on everyone's lips over there.
Tell me about the positive side of growing up where you grew up. What was that, the positive side of that experience for you?
Well, I would say that there was a great deal of camaraderie as we tried to create communities from ourselves out of fracture. A lot of us, a lot of the people I grew up around came from places of war, came from the Balkans, came from countries that were falling apart, and we felt as if we were adrift in this new Australia. And we were trying to form communities. So that was really great. That was exciting. We learnt about each other just hanging around on the steps of the flats, the flats being a big apartment block. And, we didn't have much. We didn't have much money. We didn't have many toys or anything like that, but we had stories, and we had jokes and we had music. And so we would exchange stories and exchange ideas. And it was good fun.
And a very natural way of learning about the whole world. You've described yourself as being part of the hyphen generation.
Right.
I understand you've got Irish heritage from your mom, Malaysian heritage from your father, and you were raised Muslim. You're also, of course, Australian.
Yeah.
What was that experience like growing up? Did you feel different, or in this particular environment where you grew up, did you feel like this is the new normal, the new Australia?
Yeah, it was a new tribe of some sort that we were trying to create for ourselves, and especially with hip hop, we created our new tribes. But yeah, I always felt like a bit of an outsider, like I was living on the margins. My father moved to Australia in 1980, which was only 5 years after the notorious White Australia policy officially came to an end, which was a policy put in place in 1901, alongside Federation in Australia, to famously, in the words of a politician, keep Australia the abode of the white man, to keep it as white as marble, to restrict and curb Asian immigration to Australia. And of course, they conveniently forgot about the Aboriginal Australians in all of that.
That was around until the 80s?
Until 1975 officially.
Wow.
I think it came to an end properly in about 1965, which was also the time when Aboriginal Australians stopped being considered to be flora and fauna in Australia. So, we were dealing with this legacy of racism, the fallout of colonialism, a combustible society, I would say, where all of these elements were rubbing against each other, creating friction. And the dominant Anglo-Australian society, that was at the centre, and we were all forced to try and measure up to that in some way. So I knew from an early age, and my father told me, that life would be difficult for me in Australia, that I would have to be more fearless, more ferocious, twice as hungry and work twice as hard if I wanted to get anywhere.
And you've said that there's a certain feeling in Australia that a person named Omar bin Musa, speaking his mind, being confident, being outspoken, is going to rub people the wrong way. Do you have an example of that growing up or even recently that sticks out for you?
Well, this is really funny. I was talking about this with someone recently. I'd forgotten about it. I used to harbour this burning ambition to be an Olympic athlete, a 400-metre runner, until laziness and genetics and beer caught up with me. But I remember that at that age, I was trying to connect with my Muslim faith, so I decided to get this great Muslim hat. And I went out and bought this hat, and I wore it everywhere as a sign of my identity. And I remember I was about to run the 400 metres one time. This really good friend that I'd trained with, he kind of turned to me and he looked at me and he gave me this withering look, and with this venomous voice I'd never heard him use before, he said, "Why are you always trying to be so different? Why are you always trying to be so ethnic? Why can't you just be like the rest of us? Why can't you be like a normal, real Australian?" And I was shocked at how incensed he was at the fact that I just wanted to show pride in my identity. Yeah. But then, of course, once September 11th happened, then instead of this kind of nebulous, vague feeling that you're an outsider, if you have a name like Omar Musa, you started to really realise, wow, I'm being defined as the enemy here.
You're painting a very different picture of Australia than a lot of us have, of this kind of sunny, laid-back place. Is that a kind of core feature of your work, trying to paint a different picture? You're describing a combustible society. You're describing...
Well, I mean, that's what we're in the business of, I think, as storytellers, is finding the story untold, the story unheard. And as my great hero, Werner Herzog, the film director, might say, extending sympathy where it has not been extended before. So, yeah, sure, you could look at postcards showing the sunny, shiny veneer of Australia, but I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the things that make us uneasy, the things that make us uncomfortable, that make us question received knowledge about Australia. And I think that one of the great problems with Australia, well, there are a few, but one of the great problems is this kind of cultural amnesia and this unwillingness to look at our history and look at the dark side of our history. And it means that we can't move forward.
You do this within art specifically through words.
Right.
Your debut novel, Here Comes the Dogs, takes on some of those experiences and ideas, but you're also a poet,
Right.
You're an MC. Words are the common ground for you.
Sure.
When did you discover that?
Wow, I discovered it at a young age. My father was a poet. He came from Borneo, East Malaysia, and he grew up in a very impoverished shanty town. And again, kind of like me and my friends, my father had nothing growing up, but he had stories and he had poems. So they would spontaneously create poems called pantuns, he and his friends, and pass them back and forth between each other like banter. It was kind of like proto-freestyling or something like that.
It's amazing how many cultures have something like that. It is sort of proto-hip-hop.
Yeah, exactly. And it was also tied in, I think, with courtship, So if you wanted to get a girl, you want to holler at a girl, you would pass her a poem, she might pass one back to you, And so from a young age, my father told me that poetry was a good thing, that it lived and breathed, that it was at its best when it was performed. So I was always looking for a form of poetry like that. And also in Malay culture, a storyteller is known as a reliever of sorrows. And from that young age, just tossing stories around, poems around with my friends, I realized that it would relieve not just my sorrows, but theirs as well. And we would be able to understand each other. And then when I found about hip-hop music, I realized that's also what my father was talking about, living, breathing poetry.
In case you're just tuning in, my guest here is Australian poet, MC, and novelist Omar Musa. Let's talk about discovering hip-hop for the first time. How did that happen?
Well, I think I had heard Snoop Dogg and Tupac on the radio because West Coast rap was really popular in Australia. Like, I think a lot of people could relate to it more than East Coast rap because it seemed more expansive and fun, beaches and palm trees and cars driving down the highway. Similar environment, yeah. But I remember exactly the moment when I really got into it because as a young man trying to find out who I was, I wanted to connect with my Muslim faith and find out about cool Muslim role models. And I couldn't really see any in the public around me in Australia. But I asked my dad, who's a cool Muslim dude? And he said, well, the coolest Muslim guy that ever lived, besides the Prophet Muhammad, of course, was a trash-talking braggadocio boxer from Kentucky called Muhammad Ali. And I was like, oh, man, cool. And so I checked him out, and I was immediately in love with him like the rest of the world. He was handsome, he was fast, he was trash-talking, he was a poet. He had even fought in Malaysia. And so I tried to find out about Muhammad Ali, and through him, I found out about Malcolm X and the black Muslims. And I was really encouraged and inspired by the message of social justice and the fiery way, the searing eloquence of Malcolm X. And I realized that just at that moment, I looked into the newspaper and saw that there was going to be a documentary about the black Muslims on our multicultural broadcaster on TV. So I taped it, and right at the end, there was this 30-second clip in 80s Technicolor where there were these two guys jumping up and down on stage, spitting raps over a hard drum beat and a heavy bass line. And one of the dudes had a very deep, distinctive preacher's voice. The other one had his hat backwards, sunglasses, gold teeth, and a massive clock around his neck. And I just said to myself, this is the coolest type of poetry I've ever seen in my life.
Public
and
Enemy.
So it was Public Enemy. And then I went out and I got It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And I was never looking back after that.
Tell me about hip-hop in Australia. There seems to be an embrace of underground hip-hop, sort of elements of hip-hop that in North America are less prevalent now,
Right.
Breakdancing, that sort of thing. So tell me about the hip-hop scene in Australia.
Well, definitely when I was growing up and in the late 90s and early 2000s, the elements were a lot closer. You might meet people who, you would see b-boys performing in between the acts at hip-hop shows. People who rapped would also do graffiti, all that type of thing. But now I think as it's become more popular and more commercialized, it's become separate. So never the twain shall meet in a way. The b-boys don't really turn up at hip-hop shows as much anymore. We've got a thriving scene, it's not without its problems. Like, I think it was really strange and uncommon in the world of hip-hop that it became very white in Australia in about the mid-2000s. But as soon as we realized that this was kind of a problem, I think people started saying, wait, hold on, why are there no big Aboriginal rappers? Why are there no people of African heritage on our screens, on our radio waves? And now there's this kind of new generation where it's a lot more diverse, to use that horrible word. But, you know, like any hip-hop scene that starts to flourish, I think it starts to fragment and break off into almost totally separate musical genres. There's kind of like hippie rap, there's gutter rap, there's trap, you know, there's kind of stuff that's keeping it real that sounds like it's from 1992. But, you know, I'm proud to be part of that scene. That was the scene that kind of raised me and nourished me, you know?
And so at this point, it's a big scene. There's a range of sort of subgenres and things going on. At the same time, the best-known Australian rapper over here is, of course, Iggy Azalea.
Oh, right, yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, the less I say about her, the better, as far as I'm concerned. No.
I mean, I bring her up because you've been critical of Australian rappers sounding American, too American when they rap.
I don't know about that. I mean, in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was this big accent debate. I don't know if there was ever anything like that here. I was talking to someone earlier who was saying that it used to be very Caribbean influenced and kind of patois influenced Toronto hip hop, and then has slowly become a lot more Americanized.
Yeah.
I think, you know, you can't help it when you adopt a culture from somewhere else, you can't help but be influenced by the accents, by the sound. So there were a lot of Australian rappers that would rap in an American accent early on.
It's natural.
And then, it's natural, I think. But then it became this kind of controversy. You were either in this one camp that rapped like a quote-unquote Yankee, and then, or you were this kind of beer and barbecue rapper who rapped in your real Aussie accent and kind of really overplayed it. And now I think it's kind of settled somewhere in the middle, and it's a bit more chilled. You know, we've matured a lot. But I mean, Iggy Azalea, actually I said the less I say about her, the better. She brings up some pretty interesting issues, because I think what she was doing was almost like this verbal type of blackface. Like, I mean, what accent is she trying to put on there? Like, it's weird, you know. She's from a small town called Mullumbimby, a rural Australian town, and then she speaks in a certain way, and then suddenly when she raps, I don't know what she's trying to sound like.
Was she known in Australia before she was known in North America?
No, I mean, I think this is part of the thing. She moved across to Atlanta, I think, when she was about 16.
Okay.
And she was obviously drawn to this type of black culture down south. But I think, you know, a lot of people have spoken about it in public, but it's one thing to be drawn to black culture and to be a part of it, but when you don't show allyship to other parts of black culture, when it starts to get hard, I mean, that to me is deeply problematic.
Is that the line for you in terms of, we're having so many conversations about cultural appropriation.
Right.
Is that the line for you? Like, does the embrace have to be complete? So not just this sort of glamorous aspects of a culture or, in someone's opinion, beautiful aspects, but also having to embrace the struggles?
I think so. You have to embrace it with respect and with research, and also acknowledgement with hip-hop that it is a music born of struggle and born of oppression. You know, the joy and the entertainment of hip-hop comes out of a certain element of pain. And yes, as a Malaysian Australian born across the other side of the world, I will never completely understand that pain, but I can acknowledge it, and I can be an ally, you know, and I can embrace it when people are going through struggles. And I think she's failed to do that. And she's also, even in terms of Australia, she said some quite disrespectful things about Aboriginal people, or at least ignorant things, and sort of battened down the hatches and become defensive. And so I don't think maybe she's some horrible person, but I don't necessarily think it's a good thing that she was the best-known Australian rapper.
Last question for you. We only have a minute left,
Sure.
Unfortunately, Omar. But I want to ask you about being here in Toronto, being on North American soil. What message are you hoping to bring about your native Australia here?
Well, I'm trying to show, as I said before, the story untold, a different side to Australia that you might not see on television shows or in postcards. You know, it's a new Australia. It's a messy Australia. It's chaotic. There are all these elements rubbing up against each other, creating friction. And I want to show that, and I want to try and see the commonalities between my country and here in North America, in Canada. You know, there are a lot of ways that we are different, but there are a lot of ways that we are similar as well. We're dealing with this kind of colonial fallout, and we're dealing with this messiness. And so I want to do that in a fiery and articulate way and build some bridges, you know. That's what it's all about.
Pleasure to have you here, Omar.
Thank you so much for having me.